Well, hello everyone. Let's jump straight to it, right? Welcome to my talk. Casually hardcore. How I think personally, casual game and hardcore game are outdated terms. They're not from this world anymore. And in the next half hour, I'm going to jump a little bit into that. So, where should I point? There. Interesting. Yeah, there you go. That's working. All right, so to dive a little bit more into the casual versus hardcore, I want to go to the very beginning of games. Pong. Pong can be seen as one of the first video games. And you could say it's quite casual, because it's very, very easy to get into. Everyone kind of looks at this and understands what you need to do. You need to stop the ball, it's quite easy. But the fail conditions of this game are actually quite hardcore, because you just miss one and you're out. Like, you need to start all over again from the beginning. And you could say that is also quite a hardcore mechanic. So there's the question, right? The first video game that was out there, is that already like a hardcore game or a casual game? Anyway, to talk a little bit more about me and why I think I can talk about this subject. I've been in gaming for 12 years, actually. I am currently a mobile games publisher. I focus on an audience of women, so my games are mainly for women. We mainly do puzzle games, hidden object games. We've released more than 100 games in total, and I do that all together with my partner company, FGL, and for them I'm the business development manager. Also, like I said, we focus a lot on games, on women with our games. So, for example, this is like some of the female characters that we feature in our games, quite a variety. And I think there's mysteries to sort of debunk about both casual games and games for women. So I wanted to look a little bit at this report. Came out last February, titled "Don't Call Me a Gamer." Just to single out a few things of this. It's a study by AppLovin, and it said that 67% of respondents play mobile games 3 to 4 times a week, but would not consider themselves to be a gamer. It's mostly among female players who feel that way. Basically, they spend quite a lot of time on their mobile phones playing games, but they wouldn't call themselves a gamer. To kind of compare that, my husband maybe plays Call of Duty two times a month for an hour, and he thinks he's a gamer, but these people play more. So who's the real gamer here, right? Hello? Sometimes it seems a bit slow. Oh, it's there. Okay. Also, all the generations are more or less likely to call themselves a gamer. So people over 55 they consider the term hardcore gamer still to be associated with like 16-year-old boys. So they play a lot of games, but they really don't associate with the terms. Sorry about this. Okay, now I broke it. It's not alright, because it's skipping over a slide all the time. Alright, so the next slide actually features, it goes a little bit also again into the history of gaming in the 70s and the 80s. In the 70s is when really sort of more gaming platforms started coming up. And gaming was first considered to be something for everyone, something like really, games like Space Invaders and Pong, for example, they don't really have a gender-specific look. So when you look at the advertising for these games from that time, pretend you don't see this yet. This is like... yeah, this one? All right, thanks. I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so this is the wrong way around. But anyway, in the 70s, as you see, the advertising is far more towards families. There's a man and a woman together having fun, playing a very gender-neutral game. Ha ha ha, we're playing Space Odyssey. We're having so much fun together. And in the 80s, in 1983, there was a big video game crash. It means that lots of really, really bad quality games were flooding the platforms. people just stopped buying consoles because there were very buggy games released, and people kind of lost their faith in games as a medium. So 1983, video game industry crashed. And after 1983, the marketeers started becoming more sort of aware of their message to really attract gamers. And they were looking at the market, and they saw that slightly more men than women were buying games. So they decided to really focus their marketing a lot on men. So when you look at the 80s ad here, this is not meant for women. This is meant for men who like to look at women. So this is really how they sort of alienated women as an audience also, because they were really trying to focus more on men as an audience. And that's also when you see that sort of the gender-neutral games were slowly started to phase out, and graphics, of course, became more detailed, and the graphics became more sort of shooters and things like more aimed at men as an audience. So, what do women like to play then, right? This is a study from 2018. It's quite sort of old, but looking at like a very, very recent study, it shows very similar results. This is just the nicest graph that I could find. So the average percentage of female players really like to play match 3 games, farming games, casual puzzles, etc. So looking into that, this is like an example of a game that women really love to play. This is Toon Blast, and you see Homescapes there, and there's Matchington Mansion, and all those games really played mostly by women. However, when you look at, for example, the Mobile Game Awards that Pocket Gamer gives out every year, and you look at the list of winners, there's PUBG in there, and Fortnite, and all those titles. There's really not a casual game in there, not in any category, even though these games have like hundreds of millions of fans around the world, and they make a lot of money. They're constantly among the top 10 grossing games in the app stores. But gaming is not the only media where that happens, because when you look at books, for example, sort of the Pulitzer International Book Prize, that's like the biggest one there is, and it's never won by any of these sort of best-selling authors. Daniel Steele, David Baldacci, they write games for an audience of millions of people, and they've been translated in often more than 20 languages. They're very popular, but they never won any of these prizes. Hollywood is quite the same way, because the last time that a romantic movie that mainly appealed to an audience of women, the last time that one won an award was in 1996. Also, again, quite a long time ago. So when you look at this, you can see that media with more of a sort of female touch to it is consistently popular over the last 20, 30 years. But it's not really sort of recognized in that media. All right, so talking about a game of sort of these non-gamers, these women who like to consume media as well, what do they look like, right? Well, typically they are described as housewives. However, I have a few problems with that stigma, because I think there's this. It just comes down to a few sort of traits, a few small things that these people have in common. So I think it has to do with obviously the daily life and the amount of time spent on gaming. Not having enough time to endlessly wait for loading times, for example, on your PlayStation. The last game I installed on my PlayStation 4 took 6 hours to install. Everyone who wants to play a game for 10 minutes doesn't have time for that. And it's also that people don't openly talk about these games, and therefore they don't identify with the term gamer. It's like a guilty pleasure. It's something that you do for yourself, but you don't really, you're not at a birthday party saying you know what, I played, and then talk a lot about how you played Helix Jump for 2 hours, So that's why I'm there's a lot of sort of apology about playing these games. A lot of people feel I play these games, but I feel guilty about it, I don't talk about it. I think you should just become unapologetic about it. And okay, if you play Helix Jump for 2 hours straight, that's fine, if that's the way you relax, then no one should have an issue with that. So I'm kind of championing casual games to be less unapologetic, because people are championing the fact that they've spent the entire weekend playing PUBG, And why would that be any better than playing an entire weekend a small mobile game? Wait, I'm going to pull up my notes a little bit because there were some statistics in this one that I don't want to get wrong. Right. Masculine versus feminine culture. There is a Dutch social psychologist, his name is Geert Hofstede, and he defines that cultures can be sort of also categorized by their gender based on how they balance individual achievement and social nurturing. So for example, Scandinavian countries, they are very feminine because gender roles are less divided. You see just as much dads on the street with a stroller like this as mums. You know, it's not really sort of a gender thing there. And there's much more strong focus on social well-being. So you see that in the healthcare, the school system. It's very much provided for. When you compare that to the United States, it's very much a masculine culture because there are different expectations for men and women. And it's also very much focused on individual achievements. Less so much as thriving as a community, but more thriving as an individual. So kind of how this comes down to games. I mean, I don't want to make this all about sort of a social psychology thing, but it comes down to do not design a pink gun, right? So there will be a market for pink guns, but your market's going to be very small. And it doesn't really have to do much with feminine design. It's still a very male design, it just happens to be pink. So a feminine game, it can be for, you know, it can be open to women without making it purple and pink and stuff. There's really no need for that. The game needs to allow for fluid gender roles and social nurturing. So for example, many games that are popular among women have this. They're like management games where social nurturing is an important aspect of the game. For example, look at like Zookeeper, Farmville, The Sims. You know, there's a lot of those games put a lot of aspect on nurturing the people around you in the area around you, and that's how you succeed in the games. Also, some men might think like, hold on a minute, I enjoy those games too. It's totally fine. Totally fine. This is not about being a man or a woman. This is about sort of the feminine, masculine culture, and how you enjoy social nurturing also as a skill. This is another interesting example. I think sort of the feminine game design is not only sort of about the nurturing aspects. It's also a lot about sort of the community. This game is Transformice. It was a game on Steam. It was quite popular for a while. The way it works, basically, with 50 players, you are all thrown into this short multiplayer session, and the goal of the game is to get cheese. And one player every session, one random player every session, is like sort of the wizard mouse, and the wizard mouse can build bridges to get to the cheese. The first time I played this, I was really bad at it, and all of a sudden I was the wizard. You know, the next round I was the wizard, and I didn't know what to do. So I typed in the chat like, "What am I supposed to do now?" And I was ready for this storm of anger because I was, of course, taking way too long and I was messing up the game. You know, people couldn't get cheese because I didn't know what to do. So I was like expecting this wave of hatred, but instead of that, people were like giving really useful, helpful comments in the chat, like, "Oh, you need to like push these and these buttons and do this and this," and it was really helpful. And I think that was a good example of how a cooperative gameplay can really make players sort of cooperate and play nice together, which is also sort of a feminine aspect of game design to kind of stimulate players to play together like that. So collaborative gameplay is of course also an interesting part of it. It's interesting multiplayer, but can also be interesting to look at it in a single player experience. So for example, this is a screenshot of the game Choices, which is a sort of a narrative episodic game where you have to make choices, basically what you do. And here, for example, Aurora, she's an NPC, you know, she's just a computer character. And I can choose to sort of comfort her or to like be nasty to her. And of course it has different sort of impacts on the game. And this way it's also interesting to sort of see how to play as a player. If you just be nice to the people around you, how that can positively affect your gameplay. I think this also is a good example of how social nurturing in other types of games can also give you sort of a karma bonus. You can reward people to play that way. Creativity is quite important as well in sort of feminine game design. A recent study in player motives showed sort of that different people across different cultures and age groups play for different motives, why they play. Some goals were all the same, but there were also some really interesting differences. Like all men across the world kind of agreed that the goals to play for were competition and destruction. Not my conclusion, it was in the report. And women more for design and story. So for example, design and story, well, this is a screenshot of one of my latest games where you have to design a room and follow a storyline to sort of unlock new rooms for you as a home designer and stuff. So, it's like an example of how, for example, to bring these elements together. Also, another important thing, in my opinion, to point out is that games for women are not the same as games for girls. When I Googled game design for women, one of the first things that came up was a Financial Times article. I mean, Financial Times is quite an important newspaper. And the article came up, it was about game design for women, but then it went on and on about Star Stable. Well, Star Stable, it's a fantastic game. It's like where you care for horses and you sort of build up your stables, etc. But it's clearly a game for girls, for a younger audience. Because it doesn't, the gameplay doesn't go very deep. It's sort of a wide world to explore, but there's not sort of many different layers to it. So to a player who's looking for an emotional challenge and some depth in the game, they'll be bored quite easily. In comparison, there's this game. It's called Horse World. Horse Reality. It's a PC game, and it describes itself as a free-to-play realistic horse simulator. It really is realistic. I went into this game to test it out, and I've been horse riding for 10 years or something, so I think I know quite a lot about it. Turns out I don't know anything, because this game goes really deep into the breeding genetics, training tactics, health statistics, horse trading and those kind of things. So it went absolutely really deep in the markets of actual horse trading. And it turns out that most people who play these games are actually owners of horse stables and who do breeding for specific breeds. Definitely not a game for teenage girls. And again, the Star Stable is a horse game, this is a horse game, but they both completely target a different audience very clearly. Another example of a game that kind of looks like it's for a young audience, but completely isn't, is this, Love Nikki. It's got probably the most complicated user interface I've ever seen in a mobile game. It looks very Chinese from the menu, many Chinese RPGs that have sort of very deep gameplay have a similar menu set up like this one. But this one's about fashion. It's not about, trying to be the best and killing your enemies. It's about being the best in fashion. So that is where it's really sort of interesting variety. Definitely also a design kind of with women in mind as the main audience, but coming from a completely sort of hardcore game setup to it. Also, casual doesn't need to mean that it's got a lack of depth or challenge to it. I think if you reached in Candy Crush level 4,520, I think you're quite dedicated. I think you're quite a hardcore gamer, actually. So this player obviously sunk a lot of time into this game. Quite hardcore, I would say. So anyway, just to kind of sum it up a little bit, again to the end of the presentation, giving a little bit of an overview of the main points to take away and to remember from this talk. Don't design a pink gun. Don't grab an existing game and make it pink and think it's ready for women. Really dive deeper into the structure of the game. Embrace social nurturing as an important aspect of your game design. Think about the collaborative gameplay. Not necessarily only player versus player, but how can people sort of help each other. Allow emotional connections within the game, not just romantically. It doesn't all need to be about dating. It can be about friendship. It can be about building up something long-lasting. Implement a meaningful story. If you're gonna do sort of the emotional connections, make sure that makes sense. Allow users to design and be creative. Let them make something. But most importantly, respect your audience. If you want to design a game for them, just try to understand them first before you try to design a game for them. So that was about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm still horrified. I mean, we've had this conversation before, but I still remain horrified that the pink gun thing exists still. We had the same problem in 2003, where companies presenting themselves as making games for women were literally just reskinning things pink. And it's like, how many years later? It's ridiculous.
Still happens.
It still happens. And I think one thing I think really interesting about the last line on your list of things, to me, is like the most obvious.
It should be, right? Absolutely.
For every game.
For every game, basically. If you want to make any game, just think about for who that game is, and really sort of try to research about what they enjoy.
I wonder if this is the problem, that when you're making a game, it's very easy to just make a game for yourself, whoever you are, and to not separate you from the player.
If you want to make a game for yourself, that's fine. If you don't want a commercial success, then just make a game for yourself. But if you want a commercial success, then you should really just think about what other people enjoy as well.
Yeah, and I think there's this gap, really, about just pushing. I wonder if it's almost like Dunning-Kruger, this idea that you don't know what you don't know. This willingness to push yourself and say, okay, who might like this kind of game? Who is an underserved audience? And so is it just a lack of research?
I think it mainly is. I think, like you say, sort of that understanding, like you think you know because maybe you have a sister, you think you know all about it because you know her. But then later coming to that understanding that your sister doesn't represent all women in the world, sort of.
That can't be true. In fact, actually, if my sister represents all women in the world is doomed. Long story. Anyway, does anyone have any quick questions for Martine? I have seen Martina.
There's a microphone coming your way.
Well, I'd like you to comment on, obviously, if someone can design the holy grail of games that could appeal to everybody, genderless kind of game, like, for example, PUBG, that appeals to everybody. This is very good for business. Why designers cannot come up with these kind of games? So why should we design a focused game, one for each group of people, for example?
So I think that the one game that appeals to everyone doesn't exist. Because, for example, you mentioned PUBG. I played it once and I didn't like it.
Yeah, but how to come up with something that everybody will
How to do that? Well, I don't think you should try. Because that is completely difficult. It's just like for example, with fashion. If everyone would really like the same thing, we would all wear the same thing.
It would be so boring. It would be so dull. A game that didn't offend anyone? Come on, that would be terrible.
And I think it doesn't exist anywhere. It doesn't exist with cars. It doesn't exist with food. It doesn't exist anywhere that is something that everyone enjoys.
Just one thing. In your opinion, why do you think people in China? I mean, why does a girl like a hardcore game, just like Jeff mentioned it yesterday? at the editorial. I mean, if women in China like hardcore games and like stuff like, I mean, boys do, why do you think is that? I mean, why is it happening in China?
Well, I definitely noticed that people in China like a different user interface in games, and it's a very sort of busy user interface that, in our opinion, kind of looks, sort of very, very hardcore. Because there's a lot happening on screen. Let's go. Oops, there it was. For example, there's a lot happening on screen. If you would present this to a Western mobile player for the first time and threw them into this without any explanation, they'd go like, I don't know. But Chinese people are sort of more used to an interface like this because most games they have this kind of interface.
So is it culture?
I think it is more culture related. I don't think it's necessarily hardcore that everyone there is a hardcore gamer. I think it's more that when you sort of look at the Chinese games, mainly mobile, currently in the state, that all of them are designed this way, so people are more used to it.
I think there's a wider thing with the first-person shooter model in particular, though. There have always been women first-person shooters. There are some amazing women teams who play first-person shooters. The trouble is it's a cultural context of the first-person shooter community, particularly around the old QuakeNet era, which was quite exclusively male because of its behaviour and its unfettered, basically offensive behaviour, particularly aggressive, definitely aggressive. And I think that's a different subject, I think, than the gameplay itself, I would argue. Does that make sense to you? I think you're...
I have a question.
Yeah, go.
Do you believe that the industry influenced or shaped the behavior of the market, or the market shaped the industry?
I'll let you answer that one.
That's a tough one.
What's your opinion about it?
I think that we, as an industry, can also influence what people like to play. Because when you look, for example, I think hyper-casual is a really sort of nice example of that. Like a couple of years ago with the whole Flappy Bird boom, everyone was playing it, and I think ever since then, a bigger audience has opened to these like one-tap, silly, sort of funny small games that is all about high score. So I think no one before that, no one in the market stood up one day like, you know what I want? I want a flying chicken between pipes. No one ever kind of thought that. So I think we, as an industry, typically one developer, really took a huge leap to kind of shape the market more in that direction.
Well, the funny thing is, I was having the very conversation with Trip Hawkins at GDC 2002, where he wanted to make one-tap gaming. So the Java era actually went through a lot of that Flappy Bird stuff before, but it never had the distribution that the iOS and the Android market now has. So it's like we've kind of rediscovered lost lessons. And I think maybe this is to your point about the 70s versus the 80s communication exercise. We've spent a lot of time communicating to the audience we think it should be, rather than actually trying to work out what audiences want. Mm-hmm. One last question.
I would just like to pitch into this part of the discussion, because if you think about Splatoon, which was an FPS shooter that wasn't primarily about killing people, but about painting. It was the first one that had a massive women audience playing it, although it was a first-person shooter.
Yeah.
I don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
But talk about Splatoon.
So just for the recording to kind of, you mentioned Splatoon and how it has a big female audience as well. I think that is also about the fact that, in a way it was player versus player, but more like not about necessarily shooting each other, but painting the town, literally. And that kind of felt collaborative in a way, because you were like creating something together, even though it was kind of head-to-head about scores. So I think that was also kind of tapping a little bit into what a wider audience of sort of traditionally non-gamers enjoy.
So on that note, we have to call it a close. Thank you very much, Martine.
Thank you.